It is an absolute pleasure to interview Katherine Peil Kauffman. You are the founding director of nonprofit EFS International, which stands for Emotional Feedback System, which we're going to get into today, whose mission is to foster global emotional wisdom. You're a former affiliate of Northeastern University and the Harvard Divinity School. You've spoken internationally on the function, evolution, physiochemical, and informational nature of emotion, as well as its central role in optimal health, human development, moral reasoning, universal spiritual experiences, and its informative value toward creating nonviolence in a global village. Amen, sister. Katherine, can you tell me a little bit more about EFS International?
My goodness. Well, I never had the traditional opportunities to do my work officially within an academic setting. I've been very fortunate to have people within academic settings be wonderfully supportive of my work. But I started it in the late 90s in order to be able to do the emotion work that I wanted to do without the boundaries of disciplines. And it's sort of my vehicle for expressing the science that I want to express. It's pretty much just me, but it's been a sort of a beacon for me to keep focused on what it is I really want and need to do with my life as a scientist.
My heart skipped a beat when I found your research online. I want to get into the deconstruction of the new science of emotion.
That's really what my work is all about, because we do not understand the emotional system at all. And yet it is the centerpiece of some of the best and the worst of human behavior. It's a measure to almost all of the disorders, if you will, of the DSM diagnostic manual are somehow excesses and uncontrollable aspects of the emotional system, or they have to do with personal identity. All of that is wrapped up in the emotional system. I should probably tell you some of the most important sound bites from my work, the news lines, if you will, that will kind of put my answers to your questions in context. One of the most important headlines of my work is that emotion is actually a sense. It's an entire sensory system. It's, in fact, the original sensory system. If you want to think in terms of evolution and when a sensory system emerged on the stage, I think the very first one was emotion. And what I mean by that, it was some sense of a binary feeling experience akin to what we experience as pleasure and pain. So there is a binary semiotic signaling process, even at the level of the bacterium, that has been necessary for us to learn and adapt and exercise our free will in optimal ways. So that's the first headline, that emotion is a sensory system. It was in place long before neural structures. It really begins on the membranes of very, very simple creatures. And the science piece that really justifies this is an examination of the sensory motor circuitry of the E. coli bacterium to show how there is this binary signaling process in place very, very early on. And when I talk about the experience of emotion, it's, of course, I don't know subjectively, but there is evidence that there is a binary signaling process happening that the creature uses to organize and evaluate and categorize and remember events that happen in the environment. And in fact, what I call hedonic qualia is double-barreled. It's not only the feeling of pleasure and pain, it's coupled inextricably with a behavioral urge to approach and avoid. And that's one of the things that has been missing from our psychology, is that usually motivation and emotion are looked at as separate systems, and they're not. They all began as part of sensory motor control. The feeling and the behavior is coupled together. And that's one of the ways that understanding emotion and the informational component of it, a lot of the problems that emerge are because of the approach and avoid automatic behaviors that we don't understand why we're being moved in particular directions. And once we do, we can transcend the limits of just the behavioral safeguards and use the information. Right now, there are 3 levels of information encoded in every complex feeling, like trust and mistrust and love and hate, full of information that's literally a guidance system. I really believe that to be true, and it's missing from our understanding of our humanity, and it's missing from our science. The probably one of the most important pieces of the puzzle that's missing, I think, I've really enjoyed looking at across the different people that you've interviewed, and I see resonance little tentacles from this particular emotion science going off in pretty much every direction. And hopefully I can give you a valid basis for when you see people that are doing energy medicine, and you hear about what's happening with epigenetics and the connection. Because originally, when the emotional system emerged, if you will, and I'm talking in scientific terms because I think it actually might even go deeper still, but that in terms of the sentience, there was originally, the other big headline I want to share with you is that the function of emotion is self-regulation. And that started with very, very simple sensory motor control, moving a creature this way and that toward food, away from poison, things like that. But now it actually wraps every dimension of human identity in it with the different information. So not only does it preserve the body and the stability of the body, which was the original value system, if you will, within emotion, it's about preserving the body and expanding the mind. So self-regulation is viscerally encoded within us in a way that it's actually one of the levels of logic is just a subjective reflection of Darwinian criteria for natural selection. You have self-preservation, which is mediated by the negative emotions. And you have self-development, which is mediated largely by the complex positive emotions. And the two work together such that the body maintains its integrity, the mind maintains its integrity, such that whatever manifestations of spirit or soul exist, and I like to use the language of potential, like whatever genetic or quantum potentials we have, or whatever aspects of identity we don't understand yet, like spirit and soul, emotion speaks to all levels of the self. So the concept of self-regulation, while it's really, really deep, is also very, very nuanced. Things like self-actualization and self-discipline and all of that stuff is wrapped into and mediated by our emotional system. So when you offer the term sentience, I see so much and so many layers of what you might mean by that, because once we understand the logic of emotion, how it's working, the negative and the positive emotions are working together, it's a whole new ballgame. And there's what I call a natural spirituality and a natural evaluative system that really can serve as a kind of a universal guidance system for humans sharing one global village. You know, we've really passed the point of tribalism and all that. So I want to sort of just put that into context about that's what my work is about, that emotion is actually a sense, that it serves this function of self-regulation, that there's a deep and beautiful logic in the binary categories of emotion, that once we understand those, then there's 2 more levels of information that are encoded in with the basic emotions, which are joy and sadness and fear and anger and disgust. So those emotions are actually, when you look at the evolution of emotion and the structures, the neural structures in animals, it's arguable that mammals on up experience this suite of basic emotions. And they really do encode what are called appraisal themes so each one is about something. Like fear is about immediate danger, and disgust is actually about unwholesomeness and contamination in the environment, like too many germs, things like that. And anger is about agency, personal agency, and the need to be able to regulate yourself. And so these 5 basic emotions really do stand for a constellation of basic needs that all human beings are going to respond to in very universal ways with these emotions. But the complex emotions, which are like blends and shades, are all about personal experiences that we've had. So I'm going to experience trust and mistrust based upon my personal experiences, the beliefs that I have come to hold true about myself and my place in the world. So it's this just beautiful domain of information that we haven't really tapped yet.
Okay, Katherine, what is the definition of sentience to you?
Oh my. The definition of sentience. I really like what you're doing with the word, because sentience can be such a broad and nuanced category that sort of goes out in all of the directions that really do flow from how the emotional system works. And so since one of my main messages is that emotion is a sense, I talk about emotional sentience, because the evidence suggests that the first forms of semiotic signaling were this beautiful binary experience of something like pleasure or pain. So I would like to say that sentience is, in its most simplest manifestation, the feeling of being alive, the feeling of the cyclic interaction of one's body with the immediate environment. And there's a beautiful resonance and a dissonance that is experienced when the body is in danger or the body is satisfied. So in its most simple manifestation, sentience is this lovely, I think Antonio Damasio called it the feeling of what is happening. But I would add that it's happening to me, because sentience is ultimately a sense of one's self, one's body, as it moves in the environment, and the emotional feedback signals that are experienced as some of this first form of sentience come in these beautiful evaluative categories. So there's something good or bad happening to me. So people that want to put self-awareness way up here in meta-consciousness, I disagree with that. I think that the body has its own consciousness. The immune system has a self, not self distinction. The differentiation of cells from stem cells, they have their own identity. So emotion is actually central. The whole chemistry of emotion is central to, given its self-regulatory function, is central to the chemistry of genetic, epigenetic, and immune regulation. That's why there is such a deep connection between physical health and the emotional system. So sentience, if you want to break it down, is essentially the ability, it's like a little 3-step cycle, the ability to detect stimulus in your immediate environment, then the ability to extract information from that stimulus and retain it, information that then triggers step 3, a response to that situation, what you in your environment. So that's sort of the little loop of sensory motor control that's instantiated by the chemistry and the sensory receptors on cell membranes of bacteria. And it's the same signaling systems that's used to communicate cell to cell within a living system. So sentience, when you begin from that basis, I do want to add that it has this beautiful evaluative component, and that all evaluations from higher cognitive functions our complex judgment, our language, I argue that every bit of the semantic information that we find meaning with is rooted in these fundamental emotional evaluations. So that's a big claim, and I think it's supportable. So the way I see you reconstructing the concept of sentience, which by the way is really cool, it's really beautiful, you're talking about the essential physiological awareness of the organism, as well as the more complex manifestations of human experience and peak experiences that concern our spirituality, our ultimate identity, our curiosity, our love for beauty. All of these things are rooted in this lovely value system that comes from the bottom up. But I also want to say that I've been careful to talk about emotional sentience as separate from consciousness proper, because I do think that consciousness is something else. However, it's required for sentience. And I like to define consciousness as the fundamental capacity to observe. And even though there's this beautiful chemical machinery on the cell membrane of the bacterium, where is these lovely little receptors where they're feeling what's going on in the external environment, and then it's triggering a cascade where it can turn the little flagellum counterclockwise or clockwise, so it can go forward or backward. There's also a deeper methylation system that categorizes when you went towards something, when you went back away from something in real time at a longer time scale, so that there's a memory of something that was good for me or bad for me. So then you have a memory system that's set up, and you have the stage set for Pavlovian learning. So this is a very, very ancient system, and the logic and value system of it has been lost on us. It's been opaque to science, that we haven't. Science has made what I think is the tragic mistake of embracing the not committing the naturalistic fallacy, meaning that you can't find values in nature because they're all supposed to spring from our cultural construction. And that's just not true. I think all values spring from this basic categories of pleasure and pain. And there's a lot of beautiful logic encoded in there. So my definition of sentience is very much like yours. I think that there's some beautiful overlap between the concept of consciousness and what consciousness really might be in terms of a possible role in quantum mechanics, the role of the observer, and the relativity of the perspective of the observer. I think all of those questions are really deep and important and beautiful. And there is a role for emotion in that discussion as well.
You have been such a powerful feminine voice to the new science of emotion. And for that, I am so grateful.
Thank
and
you.
You're one of my role models and heroes because of it. And you use words in your papers, in your research, in your studies, in so much of your website, the output that I have researched from you, that are just beautiful. You talk about emotional palette, attuning to become a moral spiritual compass. Mm-hmm. Can you go into that a little bit and use those words for me?
Yeah. I've spent probably the last 20 years really digging into the science of this, because the message that comes from the work is so important concerning the human condition, what it means to be a moral person, what our values are, what our spirituality is, why we're tribal, how we can transcend so many of our limitations by listening to this beautiful body of information we've never attuned to. That it meant a lot to me to go back and spend time doing the science. So, and I'm glad that I did, because it's like shooting ducks in a barrel. There's evidence for it everywhere, and I'm really happy to have done that job. But the real benefit from this work is how can it affect you and me in our everyday lives. And so when I talk about the palette of emotion, I really do like a visual metaphor with color, because you do have these basic binaries that start out with, if you will, a black and white. And I want to really be clear, though, that some of the binaries we've associated with emotion are just not true. Good and evil, for example, is a very, very dangerous binary that when you really look into what's being pointed at as evil, every bit of it are manifestations of misunderstood emotion and the behavioral safeguards that we don't understand. And a lot of what we see now with all of this division and tribalism is manipulating emotion, negative emotion in one another to gain control. So the first thing that it can do is absolutely liberate you from that kind of manipulation. And that's a whole level of experiencing life that's pretty cool. But beyond that, when one begins to understand that every emotion is delivering very specific information about what needs to change in your life, negative emotions are asking us to preserve the body. And when I was talking about the origins of the emotional system and how it's so completely wrapped throughout all of the signaling system and genetic regulation, all of that is because way back when, in the very beginning of when life was much more simple, that the function, I'm saying, of self-regulation was a combination of sensory motor control and healing. So we avoid what is painful to preserve the body. And that is the ethic right there. And that's the same ethic for all living systems. But what happens is we end up preserving the holdings of the mind instead of preserving the body. It's exactly the wrong thing to do, because positive emotion is about expanding the mind, filling it with belief structures that are not limited, that have creative capacity, that resonate with the complex positive emotions. And there's a whole new level of life and experience that you begin to enjoy. I have a little metaphor in a book that I'm writing about spiritual flatland, because when we're at this level where we don't understand our emotions and we're oftentimes using negative emotion to control one another, it's very toxic and it's so unnecessary. But that once you understand how to mine the information in the palette of emotion, you aren't subjected to that anymore. And it's like you really are seeing, in that lovely story about Flatland, where you're seeing in 3 dimensions now, and there's really no going back from it, which is wonderful. And you're also freeing your consciousness to explore the dimensions of who you are and to actualize more of your own innate potential. So it's a whole new experience. And I really do think that that's what spirituality is really about. It's about this ongoing expansion and development and actualization of the self. And that's why we like pleasure and we pursue complex pleasure. It's why we resonate with beauty. And so positive emotion really is about self-development of mind, and negative emotion is about preservation of the body, which is the same for everyone. So there really is a lovely ethical system that comes out of this. However, it's also true for every other living system. So the morality and the code, the virtues that come from this are difficult to embrace without being speciesist, because we think, of course, as humans, we're better than all the other members of our ecosystem, but we cannot survive without them. So it really does get into our understandings about sustainability and how we're choosing to behave as a species sharing one precious biosphere.
I want to deep dive a little bit more into the intrinsic value of the negative charge. And you mentioned it, but I want to ask you in a little bit more depth about the 7 deadly sins and how we typically associate feeling bad with being bad.
There's 2 things going on here. When you say negative charge, there really is a fundamental physical basis in electromagnetism, I believe, that gives rise to these categories of the binary categories, and that's a separate discussion. But I love your question about sin, because I love both questions, but the whole thing about emotion is we have these behavioral safeguards. We approach that which is pleasurable, we avoid that. And it's just so deep within us that we can't, we've talked about addiction a little bit and all of that kind of stuff. And denial, I mean, this is all wrapped up within the behavioral aspects of the emotional system. But they're basically just safeguards to preserve the body. And yet, you look up the word hedonism, it's associated with sin, and it's also associated with evil. So, but what's really going on is, unfortunately, humans, everyone is averse to pain. And so we've learned to instill ideologies that resonate with the complex negative emotions like shame and guilt and worry. And we've institutionalized manipulating one another from the outside, rather than recognizing this is a regulatory system that's supposed to be regulating us from the inside. We have this warped third-party way of manipulating one another, but we largely use negative emotion to do it. I mean, yeah, there's carrots and sticks and bribes and threats, but the negative emotions are so aversive. They're very, very powerful. And one of the really interesting, informative things about emotion is that you have these binary categories. That's the first level of information. There's Darwinian logic there. There's also a social logic that the identity that you have, Christian, the identity that I have, in fact, the identity of all living systems from bacterium all the way up, is a dual sense of identity. There's the autonomous agent, that's the individual, me, and there's the social, collective entity that's we, that cannot live in isolation. So you have both a me and a we identity, and the me is basically the body, if you will, and it's preserved by the negative emotions. But the we is all about the complex positive emotions and how we connect with one another through feelings of love and trust and gratitude and forgiveness. That's the social glue that satisfies the social aspect of your identity. So we have both of those kinds of identities that are being mediated at the same time by negative and positive emotions. So there's that binary logic, and there's several more layers to it that we've never understood. But by the time you get to the negative, the basic emotions, which are, as I said, joy, sadness, fear, anger, and disgust, you notice that 4 out of 5 of those are negative. Joy is the only positive emotion, because they're very specific things that we need to minimize in our immediate environment in order to maintain our balance, our self-regulatory balance. So this idea about personal identity, the self that's being regulated from the bacterium all the way up, is a dual sense of self. I mean, even bacteria have a whole social world. They communicate through what's called quorum sensing, which basically uses some of the same receptors and a little bit fancier peptides or molecules of emotion, you will, to recognize their species from other species, and they can cooperate and they can compete. And all of that is wrapped into our self-regulatory process, right? So we have these beautiful behavioral safeguards. 4 out of the 5 basic emotions are negative ones, because nature is very specific about the 4 things that we need to reduce in our external environment in order to preserve our body. So fear is about imminent danger. It's like there's a tiger in the room, it's going to eat me. That's real fear. And what creatures do is they freeze so they're not looked, or they run away. Okay, that's genuine fear. It's always about your immediate relationship in this environment right here. It's not in your head. So what we call fear a lot of times is a complex emotion like anxiety or worry or paranoia. And that has to do with what's going on in your internal environment, your mindscape. And that's a separate territory. But we do not understand how these four basic emotions are informing us about basic human things that are non-negotiable. So, of course, we need to remove anything that is threatening and really dangerous from our physical environment, which goes to all kinds of environmental concerns about toxins and fresh, clean air, all of that kind of stuff. We really do. It's mediated by our negative emotions. So anger is one of my favorite emotions. It's about agency and obstacles to agency. It's like my individuality, my autonomy is non-negotiable. If I'm compromising that to be a member of the group, that's not healthy for me. That's when I feel anger. And if there's an obstacle to my agency and injustice, all of that is what inspires our anger to have social justice and things like that. So there are very many messages for our politics, for our spirituality, in our strategies for creating sociocultural environments that do not do these things that our emotion are asking us to do, with like social hierarchies and limited pecking orders, things like that, caste systems. They absolutely go against our emotional system. And they predict very negative responses in us. So we talked about fear, we talked about anger. Disgust is actually about contamination. It's about dirtiness and overgrowth of bacteria in the environment. And we vomit to get, disgust. It's about poison essentially. And yet these emotions, if they're not understood, can be leveraged into complex emotions like hate and contempt, but that's a misuse of our consciousness again. So the last one is sadness. And some people say that love and fear are the universal poles. I disagree with that. I think they're joy and sadness, ultimately pleasure and pain, the extensions of pleasure and pain. And when you look at when our chemistry gets out of whack, you have manic depression. That shows that what these poles really are about joy and sadness, depression on one, meaning on the other. So that's the second layer of information. Now, those four negative emotions are very specific about how we need to design our environments. But joy is much more plastic. Joy is about finding your own personal calling. It's about discovering, and joy is much more plastic. You can be taught to enjoy bird watching. You could be taught to enjoy rock hunting, and you can be taught to enjoy lots of things. And you can also be taught to dislike certain things. But it's a lot more plastic and it's a lot more personalized because this is a self-regulatory system. And the developmental trajectory that we're being pulled by our curiosity, we're being bonded by our trust and our gratitude and our forgiveness and our compassion for one another. All of those are the states that resonate with the best optimal ways of being and doing things in the world. And at the same time, you're flooding your body with chemistry that is it is great for your immunity, and it reduces the inflammation that's associated with cortisol, which is the negative emotion. So there's a very direct link between how we're thinking and acting and using our emotions and how our body is going to thrive or not. So when you get to the complex emotions, we talked about, so if you want to think about the palette, you've got these 5 basic emotions, and the blends and shades of those are the complex emotions. They're the ones that are associated with the prefrontal cortex and with our personal experiences. But they also have common appraisal themes, like trust is all about a bonded connection with someone and being reliable to having integrity with that person. And of course, trust can be exploited, but then that's why we have anger, to keep things in check. So ultimately, the idea is to watch your life, how it unfolds, and to pay very close attention to any emotions that you're having, because every moment that you have those experiences, I like to say you're sort of tipped off of the edge of chaos. where a negative emotion is a threat to the stability of who you are. And a positive emotion is an opportunity, a creative opportunity to advance and expand who you are mentally, socially, spiritually. And so emotion becomes a beautiful friend and advisor, and points exactly to what you're choosing to believe about yourself and other people that's either working or not working.
You'd said about negative emotion, we tend to shoot the messenger instead of just thank the messenger and take the message. I just wanted to get that in a soundbite, really, if you don't mind sort of putting that back in your own words.
It's beautiful. It's beautiful. And I realized I didn't finish the answer about sin, because a lot of religion, I think the best of religion, the common strand across religions, is really getting to the benefits, the cooperation, the kindness, the compassion, that all has to do with the complex positive emotions. That's why you get this theme of universal love, compassion, turning the other cheek, all of these kinds of things. And from the East, you get the use of your consciousness in ways like Buddhism, right thinking, right? I think that's really beautiful. But we don't have to transcend or efface the self to do it. We just need to understand what the ego is and how it can become a boundary or a fierce, like a ferocious dog guarding the gate. If you don't understand pain as a messenger, there are many, many, many people that automatically just close the mind down if anything that might be painful. And of course, that's called denial and all kinds of other things. So I call that the ego gate, because you're preserving the bounds of your mind instead of preserving the body, which is what negative emotion is supposed to do. But it's just one of the natural pitfalls of the safeguards. But so with that in mind, almost all of the 7 deadly sins, if you will, first of all, 4 out of the 5 are emotions themselves. We have lust, we have greed, we have envy, and we have anger or wrath. So that's 4 are emotions. And the other ones have to do, like sloth, with I think sloth is really depression. I think it's the inactivity of not embracing your creative responsibility to regulate yourself. And of course, gluttony, and they're all about not controlling yourself so much. But every bit of it really is about the negative emotional patterns that can happen from the safeguards. But you notice that the virtues and the fruits of spirit are all about the complex positive emotions as well. So they work together. And so the idea of, I talked about the best of religion. The worst of religion is external control, using ideologies that instill negative emotion, guilt and shame. And so there are ways of using the biology of emotion to kind of launder our belief systems and look at our religious traditions through a lens of what's really happening functionally with our biology. And there is this really kind of beautiful universal spirituality that emerges, where it links to Aristotelian virtue ethics. But it's really because this is the way the body and the mind as one unit function together, and how these negative emotions serve an incredibly important purpose that we've kind of missed the boat on. Pain is perhaps one of the most powerful messengers that we have. And instead of shooting the messenger or blaming the messenger, as our religions have done, we call, these are manifestations of the pain and the approach and avoidant behavior that we have that are actually really important, because we're actually only given as much conscious free will as we can handle. So if there's more negative emotion, we're limiting ourselves, actually. But that, I think one of the biggest mistakes we make is to shoot the messenger, is to blame the pain itself and associate it with evil and powers of evil that, I think there's absolutely no evidence for that whatsoever. And if there are any polarities that are out there in the universe, any yin-yang polarities, pain is actually a message about the body. I think if we're ultimately disembodied in some way, we no longer have a need for the physiological pain, and it's a completely different kind of experience, a different kind of consciousness that might be replete with complex bliss. Who knows?
You just touched on the sort of core of this entire project, which is if we suppress our emotions or continue to sort of harbor unprocessed emotions or unhealed wounds, then we are limiting ourselves from experiencing higher levels of consciousness.
I believe that's true. Yeah, the thing that I said about the complex negative emotions is that we feel a lot of them on a regular basis. I've kind of gotten to the point where a lot of those are laundered away, which I'm really happy about. Of course, it depends who we hang out with and how we're interacting on a daily basis. But that when you experience like a flash of resentment or contempt, that is absolutely a message to you, from you, about you, and how you've chosen to think. And a lot of times, we talk about the Freudian unconscious. I am of the belief that everything is actually available to your consciousness if you're paying attention. And that's one of the reasons that emotion is calling your attention back to something that you embraced without maybe even realizing it. Because I like to think of emotions as coming with these beautiful little packages of information. But if we don't unwrap them and process them and understand them and make the appropriate response, either mentally or physically or both, depending on what the emotion is, then it's going to get packed away anyway, unwrapped. And this is Pavlovian conditioning. So that is how these complex negative emotions take root. It's not the emotions that are taking root. It's the belief structures that are taking root, but that they trigger the emotions because they're messages about that you're thinking in ways that are limited and frankly self-destructive. Because every time I experience one of those emotions, I'm flooding my body with a stress chemistry that has been identified as the source of so many chronic diseases, from diabetes and heart disease. And why do that? Why do that? So it really is self-destructive. So if there's such a thing as sin at all, it's in not understanding how to use this information in ways to regulate yourself optimally. And I think that if there's any real sin, it is the capacity for self-deception. I think everything boils down to self-deception, whether you're exporting it out and lying to somebody else. It's all based in self-deception. And it's usually about denying the truth and the reality of your own experience because it's too freaking painful. And that's the source of all self-deception, I think, is not inviting with curiosity the messenger and unwrapping it. And because the more you do that, the less pain you're going to feel. It's like the more you exercise, the less pain you're going to feel when you do it. It's like that's why the body is asking us to do very specific things to reduce these things in our external environment and these things in our internal environment. We have much more control over this than we do that.
If we achieve that, can we achieve a collective conscious shift in our humanity?
I really like to think so. And I am very optimistic about human potential because there's this whole misunderstood area that is ground zero for so many of our problems, physical, mental, spiritual. And once we kind of can recover from that and kind of elevate out of spiritual flatland, it really is a different way of thinking and being. And my own experience of sort of laundering away the things that resonate with the complex negative emotions actually frees up cognitive real estate for much more creative capacities. And I do believe that one of the main reasons we have emotion is because we are co-creators together of our experience. And that my consciousness in some way, in some small way, plays a creative role in the unfolding of the processes of the universe, the physical processes. And so whatever a tiny apportionment of creative power I have, I want to maximize it. And that what I've discovered is that as one cleanses their mindscape, if you will, of these limiting beliefs, and that doesn't mean you have to know everything. I like having a really open mind about a lot of things. I put things on a mental shelf and, oh, hey, I've never seen a UFO, but if you have, and that's cool. An openness to life and an openness to experience. That is, of course, the opposite of what negative emotion is trying to close you down and preserve. It's supposed to preserve the body, though, not the mind. It's exactly the misuse of it.
Is self-regulation the way out of spiritual bankruptcy?
I believe everything starts with understanding yourself, and emotion is absolutely essential to that, because the self is an ongoing developing process, and you're actualizing your potentials. You never really know. So to have really firm ideas about how the world works and how what your place is, especially if it has some kind of an evil idea wrapped into it, that's going to be profoundly limiting.
I was also going to ask you to clarify something for me about ego. I feel like ego gets a bad rap.
I do too.
Are we supposed to eradicate the ego? Are we supposed to integrate the ego?
That's a beautiful question. I think I'm not a Freudian at all. I think he had some beautiful ideas. He introduced the idea of the unconscious, the subconscious, which I think is really important. He did link a lot of identify some of the emotional drivers, the whole business about sexuality and toilet training. No, but he did introduce the idea of the ego. And to me, the superego is actually your belief structures that you've chosen to adopt that have come from your culture. So it's not, necessarily part of who you are. You have control over it. But that the ego is essentially this part of the self-regulatory system, in that it's going to preserve your autonomy and myself as an individual. I can't be part of a group if I'm not intact and whole as an individual. So that's why the basic negative emotions are in place, to make sure that my body, myself, is intact in its physical and social environment. I have a way of talking about the ego that I think is more precise. I talk about an ego gate around the mind. And the ego is sort of like this guard dog that's going to defend the mind, if you will. And if the ego does not understand negative emotion, then it's going to slam that gate anytime something painful might be at bay. And that's when people like the whole Buddhist thing about transcending the self, it's really about just educating the ego to keep the door open for painful information, because it's very important. But the ego is necessary because it's who you are individually. It's really a manifestation of the preservation of the body, but that it can get really, really out of hand if it's trying to preserve the contents of the mind. And that's when it becomes problematic. That's where you get denial and these complex edifices of belief structures that are necessary, that are filled with self-deception, but that are necessary to keep you feeling whole as a person. And there can be some really serious psychological disadvantages from that kind of strategy. That's why it's so important to understand that pain is a messenger from the self to the self about the self, first and foremost. Certainly, there's going to be other people in the room that are going to promote, they're going to piss you off, they're going to, make you afraid. But it really is about who you are and how you're interpreting that person and how well you're communicating with that person. In fact, this sort of ethical system that comes from mining emotion has what I call right responses. that are in addition to the fight and flight reactions of the body. And we've had these all along. We've never really noticed them as right responses, if you will, though. But fight and flight responses are supposed to change your immediate relationship to the environment, right? But we're always doing that every time we learn something from someone in our environment. That's the first right response that's there. You're taking in new information. You're developing your mind in accordance with the people in your environment. That's the number one right response. You always right the self, if you will, learn something. The second one is expressing what you have learned. And so that's all about communication. It's all about taking actions in the world. It's about working. It's about service. It's about every time we do anything that changes our environment, whether I clean the floor or put some food out for people to eat, that is a right response, if you will. But I like to use them as direct responses to pain more than anything, because it's so easy to have the wrong response, if you will, if you're allowing your defense mechanisms, your ego, if you will, to protect you from the painful truths that you need to hear. So the whole business about ego and choosing right responses as you learn, that ego is actually open and flexible to painful information, then he's going to be doing his job again of just preserving the body and preserving your human dignity as an autonomous agent. We all need that. That's why we have anger.
Brilliantly put. And that really helps fill in some gaps for me. So I'm really pleased that you went in detail into all of the different emotions and into ego, because it's something we all contend with. And this is the
Indeed.
point. Emotions, feelings, ego, the good, the bad, the ugly is what we deal with every day, moment to moment. Is that what creates our reality?
I think so. Well, another thing about the ego, too, is there's this really beautiful resonant experience that I call humility, because we're all humans and we have pitfalls like ego, self-deception, the avoidance of pain. We can't possibly know everything. We have to trust one another. We sometimes can manipulate each other without knowing it, or even with knowing it. And so, but humility is kind of the antidote to too strong of an ego. It keeps things real and makes having fun with the fact that we're all human. We all have the same pitfalls and potential problems, and so to be able to laugh at it. Laughter is one of the most important experiences we can have, and it's joy inspiring. It's beautiful, and I think that the essence of really good humor is humility, and that's one of the antidotes, if you will. But there's no way we can ever really transcend or efface the self, and that's one of my problems with some of the interpretations of Buddhism, is that you have to transcend. I think it's more of an expansion. And because there is a part of us that is much greater than the person who I am in my ego as Katherine, who has had this particular lifetime with these particular experiences. There's a bigger part of me that perhaps is connected to a bigger part of you, and all that is, if you will, which is the concept of God in a lot of religious traditions. So it's about the idea of self-realization from Hindu tradition is really lovely, because the broader your consciousness, the more creative capacity you have to invoke that creative consciousness, perhaps the closer you are to God, if you will. I had a wonderful Sufi for dinner the other night, and we were talking about like levitation and things that some of these traditions, if you spend a lifetime building these skills, and he said, it's quite common, actually, but we don't talk about it. It's not about performance. It's not a proof of anything. It's all about your connection with God, which I think is one of the most beautiful aspects of our natural spirituality that is captured in many, many religious traditions, is this sense of connection with this greater than the self with a capital S, if you will, that is part of what informs some of our most complex peak human experiences and emotions like awe and deep curiosity and the love of beauty and all of these things. It's pulling us toward those kinds of spiritual expansions that are key peak experiences in life that hint at what our potential and capacity might be.
Isn't it interesting that our discussion about emotions has led us to the cosmic intelligence, God, universal creator? Do you think all paths lead to enlightenment?
I do. I do think that there's this beautiful image of the Socratic pit of ignorance. And when I first started investigating emotion, I fell in love with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's Stages of Death, because you have anger, denial, anger, bargaining, and acceptance. What I realized was that we go through the many deaths every time we have a negative emotion. Every time there's something happens that we did not want to have happen, we can go through those stages. But the denial phase is like the Socratic pit of ignorance, and we can kind of fall in there and stay there for a long, long time, unfortunately. I like the image of sort of vaulting over all of those stages, going straight to acceptance in the first place. Okay, shit happens. Shit happened to me. It's my turn to have a little shit. Let's get on with life. And so all paths do lead to enlightenment, but I think that some of them are much faster than others. And we do have free will. There's no question that we have free will, and it has traction somehow in the universe. And that's why we need emotion to tell us when we're using it optimally or when we're using it destructively. As simple as that.
Yes. And in that way, it's a feedback loop, right?
Exactly. When I was sort of walking back from clinical psychology, wanting to understand where do the poles of emotion come from? What are they about? What function is being served? Part of that journey was finding the complexity sciences and the cybernetic sciences, which are really all about cycles of interaction between an organism and its environment. And this whole idea of the mind, when I talked about sentience, I talk about there's wonderful Maturana and Varela were wonderful theorists that talked about an inactive sort of mind, that it's not just something that's from a brain, but it's a constant process where the organism is interacting with the environment. And sentience is key to that process. And it is a cybernetic little control system, if you will. And it's the same control principle in guided missiles and that's used in all kinds of engineering applications. So the idea of feedback is that you have a machine that has a set point to it, and that when it deviates from that set point, it self-corrects. So basically you have that there's a stream of information that's about the relationship of the self. It's compared against a set point, and then if there's an imbalance, it triggers the optimal response to get it back into balance. That's really what's happening with sentience in this little emotional loop that I'm talking about. And the hedonic qualia, the feel good, feel bad, that's coupled with the response, that's both the signal and the correction, the signal and self-correction. That's why I called my nonprofit the emotional EFS, the emotional feedback system, because I realized it's this information loop. And so the concept of feedback is really central. The idea of cyclic interactions with the environment, that the mind is constantly enacted in every moment by the creature. That it's a beautiful, not just a metaphor, but it's a sort of a missing piece of science about what the mind might actually be. So I argue that there's a 4E version of mind that's called the enacted mind, where the mind is fully embodied, it's enacted in cyclic interactions, it's completely embedded in the environment. I would not be me without my environment as contrast and constant elicitor new behavior from me, and that it is extended by learning. And of course, the hedonic qualia of pleasure and pain is the substrate for Pavlovian conditioning, which is the source of all learning. So I added a fifth E to the enacted model, emotion, because it's evaluative, and none of that would work without this evaluative signal. So that's one of the things that I'm sort of known for, is adding the fifth E to the 4E model. One of my most important take-home messages for you and anybody that's listening and interested in their emotions is that emotion is a sense, the very first sense, the granddaddy of all senses. You can still notice the polarity, the feel good, feel bad in our vision, where things are sightly or unsightly. We really love beauty and we're repelled by certain things. In resonance in music, whether it's dissonant or resonant, in smells that are, repulsive or aromatic, it's there in all of our other senses as well, because it was the first. I'm really glad to have done the science, because I think that that's absolutely necessary. And I think I could have written a pretty good book maybe even 30 years ago, but it's going to be so much better now with the real science behind it, and to be able to really speak to how far it goes in terms of the spiritual dimension of the self, and that regulatory aspect is, there's a lot more teeth to it when you recognize how fundamental and foundational the self-regulatory function is, having everything to do with our genetic and epigenetic and immune regulation. That's why it's so central to our health. One of the things that I want to say to you, whether it gets in here or not, is that way back when life was forming, if you will, remember Pangaea, the original continent that broke apart, there was this simple function of self-regulation was about sensory motor control, moving the animal, approach and avoid, finding food, avoiding poison, and adaptive immunity. So the whole categories of good and bad, good for me and bad for me, that are set down in this memory system, the methylation system, which, by the way, is still a key signaling system in epigenetics, is all about physical health. So if there's any foundation for any of our moral systems, it's that. It's the same physiological regulatory functioning of the organism itself. So to me, that provides the most beautiful foundation for morality, and any discussions of what good and bad and right and wrong is have to be tethered to that, because it's universal across all living systems. And that when we use that to examine our religious traditions, we can certainly keep the things that bond us together as community, like the rituals of I just gave a talk in Turkey a while back, and it was lovely to see Islam up close and personal with, the little stones that they have they're like rosaries, but that they're doing their prayers even when they're working and things like that. And I gave a talk explaining this sort of natural spirituality that flows from our emotion, and they were translating it into Turkish, and there was this man that came running after me. I had to go to the loo after, a long day. It was question and answers and everything. And I was on my way to the loo, and he chased me down and in very broken English said, "My wife was so moved by your talk. She wants to give you a copy of the Quran." And now that to me was a really peak moment, because of all the Islamophobia and all the tribalism that's being whipped up, all the negative emotional buttons that are being pushed. Look at our president. I mean, it's so dime store obvious what's happening. It's the manipulation of negative emotions that we don't understand. So that piece of it is really heartening to me. And what I really want to say to the spiritual community, I consider myself a spiritual scientist, and I did a lot of this work at the Harvard Divinity School. So I had the opportunity to really look at religions carefully and lovingly, and to find that natural substrate. So I think that that's one of the most important applications, is what does it mean to be a good human being? What does it mean to have virtue? What does it mean to walk in the light of God, or to be like Jesus? every bit of it's encoded in our biology. And it's just right there for us to take. So that's one of my most important messages, I think, that I want to get out. So we have this beautiful stuff in our biology, and yet it's been so misunderstood that it's been aligned with sin and evil and all of the things that it's absolutely not. So we have work to do, but there's all kinds of hope and optimism. And when we actually get to the point where we can harness and expand our consciousness, perhaps, we might be a much more incredible species than we even know we might have the capacity to be at this point. So I'm really optimistic about it.
I feel really optimistic hearing you say that. And you are the embodiment to me of that sort of beautiful merging of science and spirituality that we see happening today in this evolution.
It's so much more apparent now than it was maybe 30 years ago. Maybe, God, 40 years ago now. I'm getting old. But that what I am ahead of my time. I know that there's no question about that, because, I mean, I get the fish eyes a lot. What is she talking about? But that also, too, there are so many assumptions that are wrapped into our worldview. The Newtonian mechanism, the idea of the naturalistic fallacy, the idea of sin and evil. I mean, when we interpret things through those lenses, we filtered away all the other possible ways of interpreting them. And this is a completely different way of interpreting our emotional experiences. And I was fortunate enough to be sort of an emotional sensate, if you will. There were a lot of allergies in the family and a lot of interesting experiences consciously, interesting dreams, things like that. We all have them. But when I was younger, I probably had more of them than I do now, because I had so much more of an openness before I learned so much great science, but that there were experiences every step of the way in my life that moved me in this direction of understanding emotion. I've been writing a little bit about it, going all the way back to, I'll spare you that story about when I was in jail at age 17.
Oh my.
Yeah. Actually, I will tell you that story if you're interested in it. But one of my first sort of the serendipitous things about my young life that was moving me in the direction of emotion was, I wasn't raised in any particular religious tradition, but that we went to a little Unitarian church every now and then. And when I was really young, there was a ceremony called the lighting of the candle of happiness and sadness, which I thought was really cool. And I got to do it. And I remember lighting the candle of happiness because it was summer was about to come. It was my favorite time of the year. And I was very joyous about summer. But you did this in front of the congregation and you told them what you were happy about, and that my grandfather had just died. So I lit the candle of sadness for him. But that was, to me, anchored my spiritual and religious experience in the emotional system. And then about 10 years later, my life had kind of fallen apart at this really idyllic first 7 years, which is great because everything's getting set down in the first 7 years. And then it kind of all fell apart. My parents divorced, and it was really not a good time. But that by the time I was a teenager, I was rather angry and rebellious and really in touch with my anger. And it annoyed me to no end that the police would stop me from speeding. And it was back in the days of, did you ever see the movie American Graffiti? Yes. That was like our Bible of the time. And if you had speeding tickets, they were like trophies. And I had quite a few of them. But that there was actually a cop that used to like to pull me over because he kind of liked me. And I had a tail light that would go in and out in a little red truck. And if it was wet, sometimes the tail light wouldn't work. So he could pull me over all the time if it wasn't working. Anyway, I had a speeding ticket that I thought was really unfair. And I was really a rebellious brat. And I would take bags of coin and break it on pay them off a little bit at a time. It's like a $40 ticket, but that was a lot of money to me back then. Anyway, I got it down to $16. And I said, either drop the rest of the fine or put me in jail. So they put me in jail. And it was $8 a day that you paid off. And, I actually really needed the experience because I was alone in a jail cell. I was 17, so I don't have a record or anything, but I was alone in the female jail cell. And I was completely alone with my thoughts. And I was totally confronted with, I was really angry. It was unfair and wrong that they could do this to me, give me these speeding tickets, take away my freedom. But wait a minute, I'm the one in jail. So it was like this, whoa, aha, I have some control over this. And so I really learned a lot about my own anger and my own role and my own self-regulation. But the piece of the story I wanted to tell you was there were 2 books in there. One of them was the Bible, and I couldn't get through the begots in the beginning. It was just, I couldn't do it. The other one was the beautiful novel about Michelangelo called The Agony and the Ecstasy. And so Agony and Ecstasy were, again, the emotional poles. Here I was, really the manifestation of my anger. And it was righteous anger. The world should be structured in better ways. And my parents shouldn't have divorced. And, this and that. And I should be able to go as fast as I want at 3 a.m. Come on, there's the stoplights are there for traffic. Anyway, so it was a real aha moment for me. And it was one of those serendipitous things that showed me the importance of emotion right down to the book, The Agony and the Ecstasy. So that was one of the little signs, if you will, about how important emotion would be in my science.
Yes. A foreshadowing, if you will.
Yeah.
Do you think these things are divinely placed in your reality?
I do. And the word divine is a beautiful, beautiful word. And I associate it and all spirituality with my own subjective experiences rather than the religious packages that are out there to inspire those experiences, because they're beautiful things. But this idea of the self with a capital S, containing everything and everyone and every possibility, if you will, and the realization of that and experiencing some connection to that. And I have had a few peak experiences that were really beautiful and unexplainable and life-changing, where I felt suddenly like a part of a much bigger fractal, if you will, and that ultimately everything was at the top of it. And that's the way I like to think about God, or the self with a capital S, if you will, because I do think consciousness is part of that story. And individual consciousness is a wonderful thing because it allows me to have a very unique experience as Katherine in this particular life and do these particular things. But it means that I can't do a whole lot of other things. But I think that I love the idea of a multidimensional self, that the idea of a soul to me would be like whatever. I'm hugely open to the idea of reincarnation. I think that it's the only thing that makes sense in nature. There's always a renewal of the trees and the leaves every year. And why wouldn't there be for human experience or living experience too? I don't know how it all works. And I've seen it really abused by people who use it as an excuse not to do something in this life that they maybe should be doing. But that I like the idea that there's a part of me that has had many experiences, that part of my empathy goes to, because I've had these experiences, I've resonated with them empathically somehow on some other level for some other reason. And it's the only thing that makes sense to me about any divine balance in the universe. Like, I had a very dear friend of mine who just passed away last year, who had been born with cerebral palsy. He'd lived with his mother and father all of his life. He had a successful career, but he'd been handicapped his entire life. He'd never been married. He'd never had a sexual experience. And he used to ask me all kinds of clinical questions about sex, and I would sneak him pornographic magazines for Christmas. And he was just an adorable guy, but I used to tease him about reincarnation because, on the other hand, I had a stepson who was incredibly good looking. He had the most fabulous sense of humor. He was really smart. He came from a wealthy family. He had all the advantages in life. He's a major stud muffin. So I was like, with my friend Ray, I was like, you're going to come back as a major stud muffin. It's only fair. So to me, there is a sort of a divine balance, and there's something really unique. And I think that we participate in choosing our experiences, that I chose my parents. I chose the time to be born. I was really fortunate to have that first 7 years when they were really intact. And then to have it all fall apart, to have them become other people, those were deeply painful, but richly informative spiritual experiences. So it's also a part of a radical kind of self-regulation and personal accountability on my part to think that I had a choice in those things, because obviously we all have challenges with our parents, and there are betrayals, and there, especially when they become other people, and when there's weird religious stuff involved, and you're the chosen one, and I won't even get into that, but to have that radical kind of personal accountability, you transcend victim stories. You don't have to hang out in that Socratic pit of ignorance and denial. You just go to acceptance. This happened, and maybe it's something I would really, really didn't want to have happen. I've had a lot of experiences like that in my life. Hugely disappointing, where you just put everything you've got into something and it just doesn't happen the way you hope. But almost looking back on every one of those times, it actually bumped me. I ended up somewhere better than I thought I was going to be. And so to kind of roll with that, and to feel like you have had some participation, this openness to whatever the bigger part of you might be. When you talk about divine intervention, when you talk about divine anything, to me, that's this being open to the serendipity and the synchronicity that's around us all the time. And that I do think there's a part of me that's much bigger and much wiser, and pulling the strings now and again. In fact, I would not have had my son were it not for that bigger part of me, and a very profound experience I had 2 weeks before I was planning to abort him. So,
Wow.
So to me, divinity is not distanced from me personally, but it's so much bigger than me individually. That to me, what faith is about is an openness and a trust that process is happening. And to me, that's one of the most empowering, positive emotions that can be. But I want to be really clear that faith is not faith in a doctrine. It is that resonance with the universe, that you're safe in it, and that you can trust that it works. And that, to me, is one of the most liberating things about using your emotions and moving toward the complex positive emotions. Faith is a very profound and beautiful thing to have. It doesn't necessarily have anything to do with religion, though.
You touched on a few things in what you just previously said that I think are amazing. One of them is this idea of a participatory universe.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering if our sentience is the sort of power, the charge, if you will, the motor behind our creative capacity.
Now you're getting into a really interesting dimension of the word sentience, because sentience is the ability to pick up information, stimulus from your environment. So sentience is it's a process, but it implies fields of information that are available somehow. And so when you ask about sentience as being kind of a driver or part of this process, I'm thinking of like sentience as both a noun and a verb. And that, to me, the process of the universe, the creative engine that somehow converts quantum possibilities into classical actualities. I believe that there is a beautiful sort of machinery that consciousness plays a role in. And I love to think about how emotion might fit into that. have been people like Leibniz and Alfred North Whitehead who have put forth really lovely metaphysical propositions that involve something like sentience and desire as part of the furniture of the universe, that at the very, very, very lowest level of matter/energy, where you have this quantum foam, things that are popping in and out of virtual existence, that whatever that lowest unit of whatever might be, that it contains consciousness, and not only consciousness, but desire. And the idea of desire as part of the impulse of the universe, I find very appealing, because desire is the force that pulls us forward. And it is one of the complex manifestations and simple manifestations of the fact that we love pleasure, and we're attracted to the beautiful and the inspiring, and all of the things that resonate with those complex emotions like awe and wonder and curiosity. So some of the talks that I've given about the role of consciousness proper and how that might relate to emotion, I'm pretty careful to talk about sentience only in living systems, because it's completely justifiable by the biophysics and the chemistry. You can see what's happening when you look at the little receptors on the membrane. You can see it happening. So you have the evidence that you need to really speak as a scientist. But then when you get into the concept of identity itself, and the fact that emotion is serving this function of regulating and integrating all aspects of the self, then you really do get into some of these more complicated psychological areas. Like I wrote a chapter for a lovely friend of mine who is a psychotherapist, who is suggesting that fractal geometry might be a good metaphorical context for transpersonal psychology. So you have a huge space to try to cover there when you start out with the foundations of mathematics, which are oftentimes considered the very lowest foundational science. And then you get all the way up to psychology, which is probably one of the most complex and convoluted sciences. This is all about the human mind, human experience. So that was a really interesting and fun thing to write about and conjecture about, how sacred geometry and the idea of mathematical relationships that are implied in this process that is emotion. And I think there's all kinds of wonderful, exciting stuff that's still potential there in terms of understanding the basic kind of binary valence, the very duality of experience, and the idea of attractors in state space that comes from the complexity sciences, and the idea of some universal balancing mechanism about being on the edge of chaos. I think that that's a really beautiful area of potential, because there seems to be more and more evidence of what's called criticality, which is this idea that systems are poised on the edge of chaos. Too much stability and the system is frozen, and too much chaos and there isn't enough stability to have the form. So the idea of being on the balance between chaos and stability is kind of the essence of the idea of emotion as a feedback signal. Every time we're experiencing, whether it's a positive or a negative emotion, we're in a moment of chaos. We're off, and we need to correct ourselves to get back on the edge of chaos, where we belong, where it feels natural and safe and right, like our the set point, if you will, back in balance again. But the beauty of it is that we're exploiting the chaos and the potential in creative ways that are expanding the self, with positive emotion, which is associated with chaos and change, negative emotion, which is associated with stability. So we want to use those negative emotions to preserve the body. But this idea of edge of chaos has been touted as the source of information processing and computation. And it's still speculative, and a lot of people have gone a little too far with the idea of the edge of chaos being some kind of there's a computational engine, but that I love it. And I think that when you look at the underlying kind of dynamics of self-regulation, that there's this sort of physical, classical manifestation of the self in the body, then there's something much more ethereal that's without which the self is not complete. So you have this sort of mirror image going on, and this dance back and forth between the physical and the spiritual, if you will. And that's part of the process of converting quantum potentia, if you will, into classical actuals that we then experience. So if all of this churning, beautiful engine of creativity is going on, the binaries themselves are really exciting to me as the source of the binary relationships that we then experience as emotional categories. So,
wow, that is amazing. And you were one of the few people who are coming out and really linking fractal sacred geometries with emotion in sentience.
Well, also too, one of the things that comes from the complexity science is this idea of attractors. And you have point attractors where like everything kind of goes to one little spot and sort of stops there. And you have limit cycle attractors where you have this sort of dance back and forth of cycles. And you see all of this going on with various aspects of the emotional system. But the really cool thing is the concept of spirals, which is another sort of a geometric image, if you will, that when you're going through something on a cyclic basis, the more you can adapt yourself at each one of these emotional moments, there's an upward spiral, if you will, where positivity builds on positivity. And Barb Fredrickson, who I mentioned before, who's done a lot of work in positive emotion, she talks about the upward spiral, which is a very central motion, if you will, in the galaxy. You see spiral galaxies, you see the spiral in our DNA. The idea of the spiral itself is very relative, because if you're doing these right responses and keeping yourself rebalanced on the edge of chaos every time you have an emotional experience, then you're participating in an upward spiral. On the other hand, if you are not understanding it, you're blaming the messenger, you're caught up in a spiral of using negative emotion to manipulate your others and all of this, you're actually on a downward spiral, a self-destructive spiral, which is what the negative emotions are supposed to help us avoid, this self-destructive spiral. So I've always loved mathematics. I think it's really exciting. And in my piece that I wrote for the fractal construct, I made the point that the complex plane is the same complex plane that's used to describe quantum mechanics and fractal geometry. And that in the Mandelbrot equation, there's this beautiful, it's a simple little iterative feedback equation where the output is fed back into the beginning of the equation. But what the output is, it's a complex number that has a real component and an imaginary component in the complex plane. So I made this lovely connection between that and the Schrodinger equation. I'd have to go back and read it now. But I think that there's something really, really beautiful and elegant in the open questions about quantum mechanics, how to reconcile classical and quantum phenomena. But I do think that the role of the observer and the role of consciousness is going to be part of the story. Just the idea that things are relative in terms of relativity, that from the perspective of the observer. And without a boundary of the self, you wouldn't have a unique perspective. So that's why we have egos and boundaries. We have boundary of the skin, and that I can empathically connect to you, but I can also pull back and be more isolated, if you will. So all these different dimensions of the self really come into play with some of the psychiatric disorders that we have. You notice that there's dissociative disorders where you have different personalities kind of playing out. So, but these are all kind of manifestations of the self system, if you will, and in our biology, and ways that we might be biologically predisposed, like if we're particularly sensitive, or if we have really a lot of trauma in our early life, that some of these things, predictable kind of patterns and sort of aberrations, that are all part of the self system.
The title of the film is Deconstructing Sentience, as you know, taglined from chaos to coherence. So you just spoke to that really beautifully, but I just wondered if you could elaborate a little bit.
Yeah, the concept of coherence, I really love the way the heart math people are doing it. And I think you interviewed Roland.
Yes.
Yeah, he's lovely. I remember sending him my paper, and he said, "Oh man, I sent this to all my colleagues. I wish I'd written it. You got to read this." He's really a cool guy. I love what they're doing.
Such a cool guy. They're amazing.
I love what they're doing.
Me too.
And I do think that the electromagnetic field of the heart and of other organs is really central to sort of the binaries that we ultimately experience as emotion. There's a wonderful guy who's doing work. His name is Mike Levin, with electromagnetic fields and embryonic development. And he's finding some really amazing things about how essential, including serotonin, which is, of course, one of the neurotransmitters that is involved with depression and some of the psychotropic drugs that I'm really against those approaches. I think that they're really damaging, but the serotonin actually plays a really important role in cell signaling of developing embryos. So if we're dousing our system with serotonin reuptake, to fight depression, who knows what we're doing with the signaling systems, with our cellular differentiation and things like that. Anyway, so there's real fields, if you will, that are instrumental in, there's this idea in Eastern tradition that there's an emotional body, if you will. And I do think it's the constellation of all of these biophysical things from fields, like with the heart math people are doing, just through your microbiome and your epigenetic signaling. All of it is sort of, these are different dimensions of the self-regulatory aspects of emotion. And the fact that we can experience contagious emotions, and that my magnetic field is probably overlapping with yours right now, and that helps somewhat in the communication and the flow of the information and the manifestation of what happens here between us, more so than if you were someone who is really skeptical about what emotion really is and was taking although I like a good sparring match as well, all of those things are taken into I think are a part of what we experience as emotion, from the vagal tone of the autonomic and response. Every bit of it are this sort of dance of opposites that plays out. But we experience, every bit of it is sort of coarse-grained into what we experience as positive and negative emotion. That's our way of interacting advantageously with the system, or not so much either. Placebo and nocebo responses upon the body are the direct result, I think, of negative and positive emotion, respectively.
You've said so many things so beautifully. I'm literally blown away. I wanted to get into the Descartes quote. I feel, therefore I am.
Oh.
I loved that. I love that.
All right. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So this new way of thinking about emotion flips a lot of what we think we know on its head. And with all due respect to Descartes, who was instrumental in sort of separating the mind from the body, and elevating the mind and reason above emotion and the lowly body, his cogito was, I think, therefore I am. I think what's really happening from understanding how emotion really works is that I feel, therefore I am. Cogito ergo sum is really sentio ergo sum. And I think that that's the way we should really be thinking about the self, because the I am comes from our emotional self-regulation, and any complex thinking about and cognitive structuring of identity is actually like a wave on this much deeper ocean of emotion. In fact, there's a lovely guy by the name of Mark Lewis who put together a brilliant synopsis of the dynamics of emotion in the brain, where he finds loops in the brain that are actually much more complex counterparts of the 3 simple steps of sentience. That is just a more complex way of doing the same kind of thing. So I feel, therefore I am is my sort of reinvention of Descartes' cogito, sentio ergo sum. That I have it put on a T-shirt or a bumper sticker or something.
Let's do it as part of this platform.
Yeah,
and more and more and more. Get more people to understand
critical mass, baby.
Critical mass, and taking responsibility and accountability for your emotional self-regulation.
Absolutely. Well, not only that, it's not like just a duty that you need to do. It's something that's for you. It's every possible benefit that you can imagine comes from doing this. So it's like a win-win situation. It can be facing pain, if you've had a strategy of hiding from it, can be difficult at first, but it's incredibly liberating, and I would recommend it highly to anyone and everyone. But
do you think the language of the divine is sentience?
Our ability to be sentient is our connective to the divine. So sentience is the language of the divine in many ways. And I think it's the most pure language of the divine because we experience it directly. I mean, I think mathematics is really beautiful too, but it's not accessible to everyone, and feeling is.
I'm so in love with the word sentience.
I love what you've done with it. And I think that your project is amazing. I think we absolutely need to deconstruct what we mean by sentience. And when you kind of come to this core of the emergence of sentience as the simple binary signaling, and then you see how it complexifies into all of these 3 layers of information that are encoded in emotion. And then when you start cleaning your mindscape and redesigning your landscape, if you will, in ways that are optimal, that are going to increase opportunities, need-meeting opportunities for everyone, and increase so they have an opportunity to pursue their own happiness and equate. Then you begin to have this clarity of mind and more capacity, more of your human capacity and more of your human potential is available to you as a creator. And I think that we are all co-creators, and that the most healthy way to think about ourselves as spiritual beings is that we are co-creators in a participatory universe. And that if each one of us takes accountability for how we're using our consciousness, and it becomes a really interesting and fun challenge to watch how you're using your consciousness in every moment of every day. It's almost like meditation. It's really hard to do because we do so many things on automatic pilot. But the more, it's a skill that can be built. And when you catch yourself falling into a thought or an attitude that resonates with a negative emotion, you catch yourself at it. And then you can kind of pivot it around to, okay, wait a minute. I just had this thought of being in a really awful car accident. First of all, it's never going to happen to me. I'm protected. I'm this, I'm that. And you switch it around to something that's more open and filled with portent and possibility than something that's come up for whatever reason as some kind of a message or some kind of a thought about possibilities that you don't want to have happen. And if you find yourself experiencing a moment of contempt or resentment, to really stop and reframe what you're seeing in that moment through a lens of your own accountability, or what I could have said or communicated or done in that moment to have changed whatever that behavior might have been on someone else's part, such that we're back in resonance with one another. So the whole idea of coherence, I think, is really lovely. And when we started talking about that with the heart math people, but the idea of coherence across is very similar to what I call integrity. So you have strength and unity across all aspects of the self. So that, I think, is how they use the word coherence, as something that is a system-wide resonance where the whole is behaving as a whole. All the parts are in harmony. And I love that, because it's very reminiscent of what's happening in the complexity sciences, the idea of self-organization, and that at moments of criticality, you get communication across the entire system. There's a lovely guy by the name of Steve Strogatz, but he wrote this beautiful book called Sync, and how everything, these bursts where the different parts of the whole are sort of on different, and then suddenly there will be this burst where everything is synced up, if you will, and you get full coherence across the whole system. That's sort of part of the self-organizing dynamics that I think give rise to the self-regulatory patterns that we see in self-regulation. So there's a very, very deep kind of principle of creative process that happens sort of at every level, and that the commonality is some kind of binary signaling, whether it's neurons firing off and on, whether it's cells opening or closing their channel gates, whether it's blocking this receptor, filling that receptor. It's a signaling system that is, it's a beautiful set of biochemistry that results in our myriad, the palette of emotional feelings that we experience, and they're filled with information. So if I can say one thing today that you remember from all of my ramblings, is that emotions carry information. They are rich with information about the relationship of the body to its immediate environment, to a set of human needs that are connected with the 5 basic emotions, to the holdings of the mind, whether they're limited or optimal, whether they resonate with negative emotion because they're limited. Go look at that, figure out how you're limiting yourself, and change and grow. And every time you're going to feel much, much less of those complex negative emotions, far more of the complex positive ones. You're going to be flooding your body with the chemistry that supports immunity, optimal genetic and epigenetic and immune regulation. And it's just something we really should be doing that we're not doing.
Yeah. Come on, people. Well, what you said was contributing to a system that is coherent. And, if we take responsibility and reap the benefits in our personal lives, we can also make such a difference in the system that is planet Earth.
Oh, yes. Yes. In fact, the fact that we have missed this whole dimension of value, and science doesn't talk about values. It's kind of a big no-no. And it's been a huge mistake, because the values are the same about any living system. It's all about neg entropy and escaping heat death, which is the work that any organism has to do to survive. It's eating and it's adapting to its environment, but that we have missed the boat for so long on what we should be doing, especially when we have a lot of victim stories, and we have stories about religious stories that are patriarchal, that we're children and we need a daddy or a mommy that's going to sweep in and change things with a miracle. That is really infantile thinking. It's not responsible. It's not very sophisticated moral reasoning. And it really denies so much divine wisdom that we have been given through our biology, which to me, nature speaks the clearest. The book of nature is much more precise and beautiful for any divine wisdom than any of our cultural books could ever even imagine being. I also have my own little reinvention of the Genesis story. where, I mean, if you're going to believe the story at all, I think the Bible goes off the rails at Genesis, because and to put it back on the rails, I like to say that in the beginning, everything was good. There was this beautiful tree of life, and there was a beautiful tree of knowledge that we were not supposed to eat from, because it was actually the knowledge of good and evil. And it was eating the temptation of, the story of the fall. Eve, was very sexist, by the way, was tempted by the serpent, and she ate the fruit. She had Adam eat the fruit. Then they discovered they were naked. They started experiencing shame and pain and all of these things. So that's the general story. What my story was the admonishment was not to the symbolic eating of the fruit from the tree of good and evil was actually the creation of the human ideology of good and evil, and having that replace the beautiful system of emotion that was in place as part of the tree of life, that our emotion was our guidance, and it was all we needed. It was beautiful, and it was perfect, as God said. All the creation was good. So instead of it being a story of obedience and disobedience and silliness, it was actually a metaphorical story of how we created the concept of good and evil. We ate of the tree of knowledge of good and evil by creating our own, and separated us from the fact that our emotions are our guidance system, as they should have been. So that's my Genesis story. I like it a lot better.
I love that one so much better.
And it's true. I mean,
Yeah.
It's our biology.
Yeah, it is true. What would you say to someone who feels like they don't have the power to make a difference in the world?
Do people feel like that?
I think some people do.
I think it's easy to feel. There have been times in my life when I felt the overwhelm of the world and the structural institutions that we have in place that we're so blind to them that we don't. I mean, like institutionalized sexism and things like that. There have been times when you kind of do feel like there's not much you can do. But I think that that's really defeatist, and sometimes it's just kind of lazy because every day in so many ways that the thoughts and the choices of action and how we choose to relate to one another, it can bring huge gifts to other people in our lives. And I think that's nothing to diminish. And sometimes when we feel the overwhelm of how powerless we might be as one person, that we really do overlook how much power we do have locally and globally by choosing to make the right decisions that resonate with us and that are more egalitarian and honest about who we all are, and that we all share the same set of needs and circumstances, and should be honored and have the dignity no matter where we come from in life or who we are or what we've accomplished. There's a fundamental human dignity. And if we share that with one another, that's huge right there. But I do think that taking accountability for one's life is absolutely essential for any modicum of happiness or sense of accomplishment. And that the very first thing is to start really attending to that stream of emotional information. It's always there. It's sort of just right there. And there's so much that can be learned from it.
You talk about feelings helping us honor our sacred contracts.
Are you familiar with Carolyn Mace? Herbert? I love her.
I love her too. In fact, I don't know if she's from Springfield, Missouri, or spent a lot of time there. But there's a connection there. Yeah.
I love the idea of sacred contracts. We talked previously about the idea of the human identity being part of something much greater, the idea of the soul and the multidimensionality of identity and personality, whatever that might be. And that I do feel like we have sacred contracts with people, that we encounter people that we have a particular resonance with or a particular dissonance with. In fact, the people that give us the most pleasure and the most pain I call sacred friends, because we have the most to learn from them about ourselves and about our relationship to our own humanity. But that I love that idea because it implies accountability, it implies choice, it implies a kind of a deeper destiny that oftentimes, what is the license, the wonderful bumper sticker, my karma ran over my dogma, that sometimes when we have a plan in life and we'll have something radically depart us from that plan, and there's a person involved, it's like, okay, there's something here. So I think that that's a beautiful way of thinking about what we mean by spirit, what we mean by soul, what we mean by manifesting our optimal destiny, if we will, and that we meet these sacred friends along the way that can really help us. And oftentimes it is ones that give us the most pain, that give us the most opportunity of really examining our own limitations. And I think we all have people in our life that challenge us in that way. And it's a lot healthier and more productive to think about them as sacred friends who you can learn from and grow from, rather than blaming and shaming or going into battle with them, which we often do.
Are you familiar with Dolores Cannon's work?
No.
She was a hypnotherapist who wrote, I think, 4 Convoluted Universe books. She's got an output of, she's written tons of books and done. She had her own publishing company. She's transitioned now, but she, through past life regressions, compiled a vast sort of accumulation of knowledge around life between lives, reincarnation, etc. And
Dolores Cannon.
Dolores Cannon. Check her out. Mm-hmm. But she says, I actually interviewed her daughter, Julia Cannon, who's on.
I remember okay.
Yes,
okay.
Carrying on her, who happens to be in Arkansas, very close to where my parents live.
Oh, nice.
Anyway. And she talks about the purpose of life being really about emotions and limitations and manipulating energy. So I didn't know if that resonated with you at all.
It totally resonates with my way of thinking about how the universe works. My own metaphysical kind of interpretation of how the world might work. I think we all have one, whether we are really clear about what it is or not. It really has been influenced very heavily by some of the more esoteric offerings that are out there. Like, in fact, I'm a huge Seth fan of the Seth material. I've been reading that stuff since the early 80s, and it is by far some of the most sophisticated science and spirituality I have ever seen, bar none. And while a lot of people would be concerned about the source of the material, I think it's a manifestation of the sort of multidimensional aspects of identity, and there's beautiful stuff to be learned there. And when I began reading it, I already had some of my ideas about emotion in place, and I loved what he had to say about emotion. I still don't understand all of it, but he really did talk about emotion as some literally part of the structure of reality, and being a part of the scaffolding, the same as thought, but of a different variety. And there are a lot of new age stuff out there that I'm certainly open to. And I think some of it goes too far. Some of it's really sensationalizing ideas that really aren't very sound. But I think that so much of it is justified by how the tendrils from this science go off in so many different directions. And the idea about vibration and resonance, to people, raise your vibes. And it has something to do with both your consciousness expanding, your sort of self-realization that's going on, which I think is a really hugely important part of what positive emotion is pulling us toward. But also it has to do with positive and negative emotion, and the fact that negative emotion is dissonant, and that the more of that you have in your life, it's basically getting at the same idea that I'm talking about, where there are right ways of thinking, right responses to emotion, painful emotion, rather than just fighting or running away. There's adapting and learning, and then there's communicating and changing your external environment by building new structures and more opportunities and things like that.
Thank you so much for this interview. Is there anything else that you wanted to add or touch on, Katherine?
Well, I really want to thank you so much it's very heartening to me as someone who's worked like alone and in isolation. And like I said, I've had really wonderful people that have inspired and supported me in different ways along my journey, but that it's been hard to kind of have this and have people not really be ready to hear it. So whenever I find some fine young mind like yours that really gets it, I'm really thrilled. And I love what you're doing. And if there's any way that I can help you, let me know. Because I think we really are due for a spiritual revolution. And there have been little offerings along the way that have been, like when I read about your project, I remembered the movie The Bleep, What the Bleep Do We Know? Yes. I was invited to a screening of that in Seattle when it first came out. There were people there that were familiar with my work, and that was fun and interesting. And I think it really did introduce, as much as I didn't like what they did with Candace Purr's work, it really did introduce some ideas that we really needed to hear. And the book, Rhonda, The Secret, that was another one that sort of was very sensational when it came out. Then a lot of people realized was a little bit more complicated than that, this idea of creative manifestation. But ultimately, the idea that we have creative capacities and that we have a responsibility to use those creative capacities to the best of our ability, that's just part of being human. That's new. And we really need to kind of outgrow this idea of God as a daddy who's going to come and favor us with miracles and blessings and maybe save us from our own catastrophe that we've created with the Anthropocene and all of our lack of understanding the interconnectedness of all life, and how even antibiotics are upsetting to our microbiome, which is part of this chemical system that I'm talking about and part of our epigenetics. And it's like, we have to really honor the fact that we are just one species in this incredibly intricate web work of creatures, and our arrogance, this idea that we're supposed to subdue nature and have control over nature rather than be stewards of nature. And I'm much more inclined to the indigenous wisdom that was all about thinking 7 generations ahead and being one with the land and replenishment and honoring the animal, every part of the animal that you use. I'm huge on not wasting any food, and it's really silly, but we owe it to ourselves and to one another to take hold of the capacities that we've been given to be fully mature spiritual beings and use our creativity to the best of our ability, to be cooperative, to be kind, to be compassionate, to be giving of other people's right to be on their own trajectory of development, to make their mistakes without judgment. Actually, there's a really cool distinction between evaluation and judgment that I would like to make. There's a big message in religion about judging not, and that, people say, don't you judge me. And I completely agree with that, but I would like to parse the words in such that a judgment is coming from your own belief systems that may or may not resonate with the right emotions. Whereas an evaluation is understanding the value system that's encoded in emotion. And those evaluations are all coming from the same place. So it's a kind of way of giving one another feedback, if you will, because there's a whole social level of this feedback cycle where my pain is and my pleasure, my complex pleasures and my complex pains are messages to me, from me, about me. There's also a whole social dimension where emotion is used as capital, bribes and threats and all of this. So there really is a place where there's a common evaluative rubric that we can all use. We all understand what pleasure and pain are ultimately about, how they're about self-preservation and self-development, and how they both mediate a me and a we identity that is supposed to expand empathically to include all living systems. Ultimately, that's when we feel the best and the most unified and most spiritual feelings. So there is a place, and this is the centerpiece of the morality and the ethics that can come out of this, is that there's a common evaluative way of understanding how life works. And so when it's coming from a common understanding of how emotion works, it's an evaluation, and we should encourage that. But if it's coming from your own limited belief structures, yes, that is in fact a judgment, and it's usually missing almost all the critical information that the person has about themselves and about the circumstances that they're in that are being judged. So I think there's a really important distinction there, but that we do need to have a rubric of evaluating our own behavior, and one that's standard across all humans, because there are things that are universally wrong, and we're doing a lot of them all the time.
How important is developing our intuitive sense to our sort of emotional wellness, if you will?
Intuition is such a beautiful, beautiful concept. And unfortunately, it's been kind of watered down by the psychology community. It's become a catch-all word for sort of snap judgments. Oh, it's intuitive to think of this and that. That's not what intuition really is. Intuition, in my understanding, is a capacity that all humans have. It's kind of an inner sense, if you will. It's something that is nascent to us, that oftentimes too much logical and linear thinking and too much information to the contrary can sort of block it, if you will. I think that intuition has normally been associated with the feminine component and emotion. I think that the two things are very, very much interrelated, because once you get on top of your emotional baggage, if you will, and you really begin to launder your mindscape of anything that's resonating with the complex negative emotions, you really do have a lot more cognitive real estate, if you will, to discover other aspects of your organism, if you will. I mean, there's the left brain and the right brain, and they work together, but there really is a kind of a gestalt way of thinking that's associated with the right brain and creativity and emotion, that once we can kind of balance the logical, linear, sort of more slow with this more gestalt, interconnected way of thinking and having insight and making creative connections between things, then our intuition can be honed. And I think that we're all naturally kind of inclined to intuit things, if you will. I think we all have some small capacity for telepathy, precognition, and aspects of the human brain or mind or system, if you will, that we don't understand yet. And I think the more we clean up the belief structures that we have, the more likely we're going to have more intuitive capacities. I do think that when we have insights about something that might happen in the future, like, they're almost always emotionally charged somehow. And so it's hard to distinguish whether there's something real there that you're kind of intuiting, or you're picking up somehow from the realm of the possible, versus stuff that's just from your own belief structures. So it's really important to parse the difference between those two things. But I do think that we have very deep intuitive capacities that has something to do with the empathic overlap between selves, if you will, which is emotional as a substrate. Like Stuart lost his daughter when she was 13 years old. She was hit by a car, and about a month before that, he had this sort of premonition that something might happen to her in that area. And it was a really horrific experience to go through. I think losing a child is probably the worst thing that can happen to a human being. But that he also had a very close friend who had a dream about him that night where he was doubled over in pain and his wife was holding him and she thought he might be dying because she had a deep empathic connection to him and didn't know that this had happened. But he told the story recently after his wife passed away. He felt more comfortable sharing the details of that horrible situation. And a science writer wrote about it in a book recently. And so it opens this whole area of inquiry to science when we start really taking seriously that the mind has these capacities and dimensions and ways of connecting across time and space and self, if you will. That I think some of the best way of kind of harnessing and cultivating those capacities, because I think they are skills that can be built. I mean, there are people that make livings doing psychic readings. And in fact, I did that when I was much younger, and there really is something to it. Most of the information was coming from the people themselves, and it became clear to me that that's how it worked. But it really did work. And I was kind of astounded how well it worked. Then I started noticing that there were these common human patterns, and I became much more interested in those common human patterns than in looking at the details of things they were asking me about in their lives. And then it became part of my search to understand emotion. And it was more about universal human challenges and pitfalls and our uses of creativity and all of that became much more important than the little questions they were asking. And as I made that shift in my own consciousness, I became less inclined to do that anymore. But I was pretty good at it.
I'll bet. Do you think we're all our own channels?
I think this idea of multi-dimensions of the self, and that emotion is the beautiful process that unites and integrates the different aspects of self, that in my own peak experiences in life that I have been channeling my soul, if you will, some bigger aspect of me that knows more, is wiser, and is sort of ever present, but allowing me my own free will and my own learning experiences through trial and error. That to the degree that I am in touch with that aspect of myself, that I do think I'm channeling, if you will, greater dimensions of who I am, and therefore manifesting and actualizing more of my own self potential in doing life in this way, and using emotion in this particular way. I think it's incredibly liberating, incredibly empowering, and incredibly important for the species right now. We've gone without it for far too long. I have this little graphic in one of my talks about how in terms of this upward spiral where we have self-preservation, self-development, and self-actualization as sort of the trajectory of how it all works together, there's also a downward spiral into self-destruction. And we're kind of down there, like we are here in terms of emotional intelligence. I have this little scale of 1 to 10 rather than some of the, complex tests and everything that are out there. And I think about the very, very lowest level as unconscious incompetence, and then conscious competence, and then unconscious competence, where we have habituated to it. We have all the right ways of thinking that are in place, and they're resonating with the complex positive emotions. We are unconscious because it's all gone into habit, but we have all of our consciousness freed up do much more creative and interesting things. So we have a long way to go. I put us at about a 3 on the scale of 1 to 10, where not only, and pure animal intelligence is about a 4, but we humans are unique in constructing ideologies and social structures and limitations that actually add a whole new layer of social distress. So we are our own worst enemies as it concerns emotion. And then we think that we're just mismatched because we're not living in ancestral environments when we've created this whole layer of social distress that's completely unnecessary.
Yeah. Do you think the future of humanity hinges upon our capacity to harness emotional sentient intelligence?
I do. I really do. I think it's the one thing that has been missing. And so many of our current problems are traceable directly to the fact that we do not understand our pain. We do not understand the myriad layers of information that are offered to us in our emotions, that so much of our tribalism, so much of our short-sightedness is because of the urgency and the ubiquity and the power of pain, that we've just totally missed the boat on what it means and how to leverage it to our advantage. And yet this value system has been with us since the emergence of life, if not before. And so there's really no excuse for it anymore.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you so much for your work and your contribution.
Thank you for getting it. I love it. I love it when I see
exactly what you've been doing, and you've been doing it so well for so long. You are a true hero, I said earlier.
Thank you.
And, it's an honor to sit here with you today. And I will spend the rest of my life promoting this message to the best of my ability.
Oh, you're wonderful. And you've brought your own dimension of wisdom to it, which I found really inspiring. You know, just taking the word sentience and doing with it what you have, finding that common thread and reaching out to so many people who are describing the phenomenon of our actualizing more of our potential by understanding more of how our organism works with the physical, the mental, and the spiritual aspects of health. And I love what you put together, and I really look forward to seeing it take off and fly and really share some stuff that is just so missing from our way of looking at the world. Thank you.
It's a pleasure, and it's an art and a creative offering, if you will. Do you think feeling is an art?
You know, I think using one's consciousness in an optimal way is absolutely an art. And I think that the feeling dimension is how we learn how to do that. So yes, but it really is all about using our consciousness, discovering how we're using it on a moment-to-moment, day-to-day basis. And so much of what we think is unconscious is actually right there if we're paying attention. So to pay attention is wonderful, but to pay attention to the emotional stream of information is imperative, because it's only from that we're going to be able to open to these other capacities that we might have, and to live more fully and creatively and consciously and happily and productively and cooperatively and sustainably. All of that springs from this beautiful value system that we've all been endowed with. It's the most beautiful gift of nature, the most beautiful divine gift from God that we could possibly have. So we need to take it and unwrap it.
Yeah, stop throwing it away,
exactly.
Ignoring it, smashing it, escaping it, embrace it.
Yeah, and honoring it in other creatures as well.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, thank you. I think that's a wrap. We've covered so much ground. I must be exhausted. My arms are about to fall off.
Oh man, you're amazing.